for later. With that, I'd like to welcome today's panelists. Eric Gonzalez, the floor is yours.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the plenary, COVID-19 Crisis and Washington's Response. It's a panel with Washington lawmaker Senator Saldaña from the 37th District, which includes Seattle Central District, North Beacon Hill, Columbia City, Rainier Valley, Skyway, and Renton. And we're also joined by Representative Kirsten Harris-Talley, who also represents the 37th Legislative District. Joining us as well is Representative Taylor of the 30th District, which includes Federal Way and Milton, and Representative Simmons from the 23rd Legislative District, which includes Bainbridge Island, North Kitsap towns of Silverdale, Paulsbo, Kingston, and Port Gamble. We will be discussing Washington's response to the COVID-19 crisis and their vision for ways the future of the justice system in the wake of the crisis of COVID-19. I am your moderator, Eric Gonzalez. I am the legislative director of the ACLU of Washington, but in my former life, I was the director of the Equal Justice Coalition, so it's nice to be in your company again. So today we will feature a number of questions regarding this year's virtual session, and hopefully it's the only virtual session we'll ever have, and future efforts to reform the justice system and to realize equity for communities of color and people living in poverty. So with that said, we'll go ahead and open it up with the first question. And we've got about 8 or 9 questions prepped. If folks have questions, feel free to use the question and answer tab, just so that we can better track the questions that are coming in and that you'd like to hear answered. Otherwise, they could get lost in the chat feature. So we will be monitoring both, but for sure use the question and answer feature. Question number 1, and this is intended to be a whole dialogue, so it's not intended for just one individual to answer, so hopefully we'll be able to answer most of these questions within 60 minutes. So question 1, this year we saw a marked increase in the number of women of color serving in the legislature, and the election of Representative Simmons as the first formerly incarcerated lawmaker in Washington. Each of you have spoken about the importance of representation among elected officials. Could you talk a bit about your background and what your lived experience contributes to the legislative process? And since we mentioned Representative Simmons in that question, we'll have you kick us off.
Thank you so much, Eric. And apologies, my internet is unstable, so I hope you guys can hear me. Can you hear me? Yes? No? Uh-oh.
We can hear you.
Am I back? Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, great. Yeah, so I think, my election was really meaningful to my community of formerly incarcerated people because we've never had as far as we know, a representative or senator who's actually been inside prison. And, part of my story is that I've been in prison, but a lot of that was because I grew up in generational poverty and was without opportunity and had a lot of adverse chances as well. So I try to bring all of that to the work that I do. But, it's something about, seeing other people who have over these really difficult barriers that a lot of people in the access to justice community are fighting for around legal financial obligations and record vacating and poverty and so many intersecting issues, become an elected official that then gives hope to others that they can do that too. And so I think, the hope that I can give to other people and with my identity, but then also the lived experience of actually being in prison and knowing the bureaucracies and the conditions of confinement and the family separation and so many other problems that we're facing when you've been in prison is something that I can bring to my caucus and hopefully strengthen all of our policies as they come through.
I guess I can go next. as a Black woman who's not the first Black woman to represent the 30th District, I am so thankful to carry on the legacy of strong women, progressive women who are really looking at what the needs of the community are. And part of my lived experience is, being a Black woman who's grown up in small towns and understands and relates a bit more to the suburban experience. In my professional world as a public interest attorney, I don't know that there are very many public interest attorneys in the legislature. And so my association with Northwest Justice Project, PDA, King County Bar Association, Eastside Legal Assistance Program, I've been able to be a part of a lot of our legal aid community and see how our work gets done, and then watch how the policies that are made actually interrupt our ability to serve communities. And so I try to bring that particular perspective in analysis and advocacy in the state ledge.
This is a really great question, and I feel really proud to be one of 4 Black women who joined the legislature simultaneously, the largest class of incoming Black legislators that our state has ever seen, joining folks like Senator Saldaña. I remember when Senator Saldaña was the only person of color, right? Woman of color in the Senate. So representation definitely matters. Part of why representation matters is for the House, we have 1/3 of our members are members of color. We have 9 Black members now between the House and the Senate, and we are not a monolith. And our lived experiences are unique. And Rep. Taylor's experience of what it is to be a Black person in the suburban context of a changing, shifting district that's just starting to embrace what diversity looks like. And me being in my district that has been diverse since its inception because of the way redlining shaped my district, the fact that we get to sit next to each other and banter and be right there making the decisions and having those conversations together. But also the diversity of lived experience, like Rep. Simmons' experience, having been previously incarcerated, but also the experience of a lawyer with my activism experience. The intersection of all those pieces when we're talking about the impact of policy on real people. Right? These are not abstract ideas. These are laws that are going to hit families and hit people. So all of that is, to me, what makes the difference when we're in those deliberations and when we're able to hold the line, because our lived experience sees something that other colleagues in the room wouldn't have been able to see.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit in terms of, for me, my background is one that had some interactions with law as a child and as a young person, in a way that really made me feel that the law was set to actually make it harder to be a kid and have real opportunities. And so, I mean, that I was raised in Delridge, just outside of High Point projects, and I saw how police interacted with us, and how, in the case of one of my childhood friends, he committed a crime, but then and had many opportunities to interact with the juvenile justice system in a way that would have given his family resources and opportunities, and instead had nothing until he committed a crime that they tried him as an adult, as a 14-year-old, and locked him up for life without parole. And so that's my experience, as us being tough on crime and the generations of impact that has had on my family, on my community, on the community that I now have the honor to represent. And that was a big part of why I wanted to get to Olympia, was to make sure that whether it was the youth that I live nearby and help raise, or if it's agricultural workers that continue to do the work that my family historically had done just a generation ago and continue to be excluded from many laws. That it was important to me when Pramila Jayapal went to Congress that the 37th and the state had at least one woman of color in the Senate, and to make sure that never again would that be the case. And I'm proud to say that every year we've doubled the women of color. This last year, Senator Nobles counts for 2. And so now there's 5 of us that as women of color are there in the Senate with our lived experiences, not being able to be othered by our colleagues because we're there in the room They get to know us, they get to know our families, they get to know our districts in a different way. And it allows more space to be at the table and for more of what is possible to actually, help expand what is possible in terms of changing laws and how quickly we can do them.
Great. Thank you so much. And as you can see, we're just surrounded by these powerful women that are in charge of really sort of directing our policy at the state level. So just want to say thank you for all your work and just for showing up the way that you do. Question number 2, the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic downturn disproportionately impacted communities of color. Could you discuss legislative efforts to address this disparity? If anyone wants to take this on.
Well, I can start. I actually was going to start with one of the House bills that came through early. That was $2.2 billion that we passed early on, mostly reallocating federal funds, but really expanding testing and vaccine distributions, providing support to our schools, making grants available to small businesses. And a big part of that during COVID was making sure Department of Commerce did a better job of partnering with trusted advocates and culturally competent connectors to our small business communities across the state. That was really important. Of course, just continue to fund basic housing and food assistance. And I think the other piece that I had the honor of working with my colleagues in the House on, especially Representative Harris-Talley, is on creating and expanding the Worker Relief Fund for undocumented individuals who were left out in the cold by the feds entirely under the last administration and were impacted severely by COVID, being able to provide real relief to individuals regardless of their status if they lived here in Washington state.
What I would add is that on the House side, we reprioritized 4 types of bills that would allow us to really focus our efforts. Racial equity was through and through on everything. So everything had to have a racial equity lens, but there were specific bills that addressed racial equity. And we passed more than 70 bills that had that focus. Economic recovery. So if you think about all the kinds of things that would support community, like, renter protections, House Bill 1236, Senate Bill 5160, not only did they address the economic recovery and protecting families, but we wanted to make sure that the resources and the funds were distributed in a way that supported BIPOC communities. Climate change. If there was ever an area where folks sometimes don't see the connection between BIPOC communities and climate, that conversation is changed this year, in particular, in the face of the fact that we have so many legislators of color and folks who have an experience that is outside the power elite that is in existence with our historical legislative body. And then, of course, COVID response, as Senator Saldaña she touched on all the direct work that was done to support communities, and just knowing that we did this with the lens that mutual aid organizations were hitting the ground running while we were in interim. Some of us weren't even in office. We were working with some of these organizations. We were making sure that the information, the resources that they were providing were getting out into community, and we carry that spirit into the legislature and that sense of urgency as well.
I just want to re-emphasize how essential it is, and really connecting the first question, to have the representation in the committees and rooms so that racial equity was a lens that was immersed in these policies. Some really concrete examples of this: the working families tax credit. We've technically had that legal in Washington state for a decade. We have never funded it. It puts dollars directly back in folks' pockets. The best tracked way we know to actually give relief to folks is to give them dollars. They know where they need it, where it needs to be invested, whether in a car payment to get them to work, or that medical bill that they wouldn't have been able to pay, or that college bill that's going to make sure someone has that transition support they need. And we know who's impacted by that most. It's folks of color and poor people in this state. But the lens that was added this year with Rep. Ty in the House stewarding that bill is that there was specific language around I-10 recipients. So making sure that some of our undocumented neighbors, not all, because I-10 is still a narrow margin of our undocumented neighbors who deserve care and were not allowed care from federal, state, or local level with government dollars in most cases. Those sorts of things made a huge difference. So the lens approach that I'm seeing happen is about who's in the room, who's in the committee, the questions, and what we're demanding to get bills out of those committees. And I saw that through and through with the bills that actually made it over the finish line, that folks were saying, I don't see how our communities are held here. And there were a few laws I know that didn't make it over the finish line because we thought communities of color were going to be too disproportionately impacted by them and they needed more work and voice. Urgency was around resources, and now it's going to be about implementation. So we're still going to need to be doing work in our districts to make sure as those dollars are reaching the county and city levels now, that the folks in our direct communities that we serve are knowing those programs are there and getting the dollars. That's going to be now the big hurdle through interim and early next year.
Representative Simmons, you've got issues with audio? Okay, we can figure it out. We'll go on to the next question. In the meantime, oh, there you are.
Sorry. Thank you so much. I just want to say I want to uplift what my colleagues have said, and I'm really proud of our budget. Our budget, really reflected our values around centering racial equity and getting, community the relief that we needed during the pandemic. Also, I think that the representation is linked to implementation of the budget as well. For example, if we are giving commerce funding for small businesses, right? It is incumbent upon us as legislators from different diverse communities to make sure our communities know of that resource and are applying for those grants for their small businesses. I will say one thing something that I brought to the legislature is that we've never funded reentry services outside of the Department of Corrections. And I was able to learn enough in my freshman year to get a $5 million fund where small grassroots nonprofits can apply for reentry funding to help people coming out of prison. When Blake was decided, the issue for civil legal aid needing funding wasn't on the radar for anybody because we don't have civil legal aid attorneys in the legislature, and it was the public defenders, the prosecutors, the counties, and I was able to uplift the fact that civil legal aid has a role in helping people re-enter and helping people with their court fines and fees and record vacating and all of this. So I think the representation really and are a stronger legislature in both our funding decisions, but also implementation because of it.
Eric, I don't know if we're taking questions, but there are some things we did more specifically around healthcare that if I can just add a little, because I think it is really important. The pandemic definitely, we already knew we had health disparities before, and the pandemic just helped amplify and clarify how important it is to address long-term issues. But this session, a couple of things that we were able to do. One, I had put into the chat just for my colleagues, right, is that with Senate Bill 5068, which expands the postpartum Medicaid coverage for new birth parents from 60 days to a whole year post-birth to help close those health equity gaps. We also, to something that Representative Taylor mentioned, is that we did pass the HEAL Act, which is environmental justice policy that really does force over 7 of our agencies to think about root causes of those health disparities. So many of them are external factors, including pollution, carbon, but other co-pollutants as well. And between that and the other climate bills, we're able to get air monitoring fully funded, and that is already starting to roll out, and hoping that will make a big difference. A couple of others, Senator Kaiser introduced Senate Bill 5052, which requires the state to create health equity zones that will develop projects to address communities' most urgent needs. And another one that many of us have worked on for a few years is about trying to get equity for international medical graduates. And so we have House Bill 1129, which moves that work further along to provide limited licenses. We have so many talented professionals coming as refugees and immigrants, fleeing climate, fleeing economic, and fleeing war to become participants here in Washington, and are sometimes limited by some of the barriers that we've put in place. And so that's another one that I wanted to highlight.
And don't forget childcare with your Senate colleague, Senator Wilson and Representative Sin on the House side. Childcare has been, again, a top of mind for so many families, and it became a critical crisis in the pandemic. And so I think what I would say is, like, the efforts that we put in collectively is a down payment on what we really need to do to really support the whole community. And so these conversations are ongoing, and this is work that will happen over years and years and years.
Great. Thank you so much for that additional content. So there's a question regarding housing in the chat, and I believe that question 3 may address it. So I'll ask the question. As a result of the pandemic, hundreds of thousands of Washington households fell behind on rent, and the pandemic laid bare how unstable our housing access is for many Washingtonians, particularly BIPOC people. Could you describe the legislature's efforts to address the issue, and what do you think should be done in the future to increase housing stability?
I'll take the first part of it. I know all of us have worked very hard on this issue. It was definitely a priority of the legislature. And I would say Washington State has received, through the CARES Act and other resources within the state, about $1 billion for rental assistance for the community. The most significant challenge is getting it out into community. I think less than 25% of it has been actually spent to help support folks who need rental assistance and landlords who are seeking rental assistance when there are some difficulties there. Part of that is the paperwork. Part of that is the lack of knowledge. It's, who has access to the traditional systems that would distribute those services. We also have experienced folks in areas outside of King County who have implementation challenges. They don't have the staff, the capacity to actually get this money out there in an efficient and quick manner. So I know that the Black Members Caucus sent an urgent letter to the governor earlier this year saying we need to extend the eviction moratorium, because and there's a misnomer that many of our community members think that a moratorium for eviction means that they are not having to pay rent, and we're going to have some challenges there. And we'll get into the Senate Bill 5160 around the bridge and transitioning, but essentially, the community isn't accessing, for multiple reasons, the resources that are available to our residents. And so we absolutely need to find more collective ways to help folks get that rental assistance and get them whole again.
Yeah, I want to say one thing that I've heard a lot of positive feedback was about our effort to allow local jurisdictions to raise the tax, 0.1% for affordable housing. That is a positive step towards helping local communities. Also, the funding that we give to the Housing Trust Fund. I just went and did a tour of a local project where we're building 72 permanent supportive housing units. Is still not enough. We need more. And I think that the solution probably rests in our zoning laws and allowing for more ADUs to be put on, larger lots and things like that. So it's a complex issue. It's not my area of expertise, but I'm definitely grateful for my colleagues who do have that expertise, and am committed to being a partner in the fight.
I will say the considerations, I think, with the impacts of COVID, and want to bridge with what Rep. Taylor said. Rep. Taylor is the chair of our Black Members Caucus. We proactively have been having meetings with folks in the Black community. And I just need to name many communities were impacted, but the Black community specifically, when you're talking about federal aid for small businesses, 98% of Black businesses were refused. Not didn't apply, did go through the process, were refused the funds. So there are some very deep inequities and systems that we were considering, how do we shore them up as best we can in this session with state level dollars. We are extraordinarily blessed that we had one-time federal dollars come down. The systems and the speed at which those dollars are distributed do not look the same within Washington state. We know that there are gaps in the system. One piece that the Black Members Caucus brought up explicitly is that one of those big gaps is equity and access in our court systems and how the court systems were impacted by COVID. And what dollars there are or not there is going to protect people through this bridge period. So I just want to be clear about that. If we're going to talk about justice and how court systems interact with this housing issue, getting this piece right will make or break a lot of pieces that we've just made down payments on in our state. We are going to continue to need far larger state level revenue to actually have where we've made down payments with one-time federal dollars, things to stick. And I also want to note, we can't just talk about housing inventory, rent and mortgage. We need to also talk about what it is to be in housing and paying your bills. And I'm saying that because people are also facing down, if they've been unemployed or unable to pay, 2 years worth of overdue utility bills, which is another factor that pushes folks out of housing. So there's a lot of layers that we had to shore up for resources. I'll also say I am cautiously optimistic about this transition moment with the pandemic. I'm also worried about the Delta variant and what it means for our ability to actually transition out of a moratorium stance as we shore up these systems. So it's something we're going to have to continue to keep an eye on and possibly address in 2022, and hope folks watching the organizations you're a part of will stand with us as we have to be nimble to respond to the emergent crisis we're still, quite frankly, living in. We are not past this moment, not by a long shot.
Great, thank you so much. Next question. All children across the state have had an education disrupted over the past year and a half, but many students of color and students with disabilities have had even less access to learning than their peers. What do you think the long-term impacts of this educational disruption will be, and how should the state address them? There's also a question by Helen around funding and support services for agencies such as DCYF. So maybe we can touch on that as well.
I guess I'll start since nobody else is going. As a parent of a young child who was impacted by this, and auntie to another child who definitely has had a lot of mental health issues because of the disruption in education. I'm seeing that and also across our state, every single inpatient psychiatric unit for children is over capacity. Our youth suicide is through the roof. It is something that we are working during the interim to address on how are we going to increase behavioral health access to our children who have suffered in so many ways, not just from their education. In my view, meeting standardized testing is the very least priority right now. It is really about getting kids the care that they need to recover from this disruption mentally and get them well. So whatever that takes as far as extending educational time, I mean, I'm all for raising the age around when people quote unquote become an adult and are cut off of certain benefits. And for sure, there's probably some things that we can do with DCYF around youth in foster care and making sure that they can still receive support and funding to make up for this. It's a lot that we're going to have to continue to look at, but getting them the help that they need with mental health right now is a priority.
Great.
I will note that one of the tools in our toolkit on that front that was just so brilliantly articulated by Rep. Simmons is that we passed the capital gains tax credit and dedicated those funds to our education legacy fund. The beauty of tying it to the education legacy fund versus our other funding pots of dollars is that there's flexibility, 0 through continuing education, to dedicate those funds in different ways. And to that point, we did a lot of infrastructure building around how to shore up the policies around funding calculations and pieces for schools around the projections from 2019 instead of the 2020 year to bridge the funding that they would have dedicated to their schools. And we also put a lot of investment in mental health services, medical services, those other systems pieces. And we're going to have to continue with the implementation there as we're bridging our children. And I say that preschool kids, I have a first grader and fifth grader who are going to be starting in just a couple weeks. I know Senator Saldaña has little ones as well, right? As we're looking at what it is to be in education in person. College students are getting ready to go back to campuses as well. We've also been checking in with those institutions about what staffing they have on the ground. Quite frankly, there's a little bit of a gap between the dollars being in place and folks having the staffing they need to bridge that. So we're going to have to continue to make sure that the practitioners we need in schools, beyond the teachers and educators, are there to hold our families and students through this transition. I feel very blessed to be in a state that prioritized progressive revenue and invested it in families in that way. So we have the flexibility right now, right when we need it. And we're going to have to continue to be responsive. I'm also delighted that the changes happened on the federal level when they did, so that the federal dollars in this education space is getting back to where it should be as well. So hopefully our collaborations at the state and federal level will continue to be solid in this as we all figure out what it looks like to go back.
I'm just going to add, because so much about what we know needs to happen around education, we do have some great practitioners. We have great leadership in this space. What we have is a lack of understanding of what it really costs, and what it really, what that investment can really save us down the line. And so, I mean, I think to Representative Harris-Talley's point, I mean, we did cap gains. It was the first time that the Senate got it out. It was incredible. It's important. And it did not fix our upside down tax system that we have in place. And I'm working on a transportation package, which is about jobs and opportunity. And every one of the revenues I have to choose from are regressive. And so I do think that the work that is happening, I know that Representative Frame is very passionate about and taking a lot of leadership, but many of the folks here as well, about how do we look at who's paying and who benefits, and how do we actually build political will for investing in our commons, and how critical that is, because none of us can face the pandemic. None of us can face this climate crisis alone. And as much as I save and as savvy as I am, I'm not going to be able to help my family unless we have infrastructure that actually works to address these problems, these huge existential issues that our kids are talking about right now, right? And so I think that is something that I just feel like is really important to the amazing audience I know that you are, and how smart and savvy you are, is that we need your intelligence. We need you having conversations, and because there's just so much disinformation and disorganizing nature that is happening as women like us get into places of leadership and power. There's a whole force that is trying to undermine the ability of government to do good. And so, and that is organized, and it's intentional, and it happens in many of the boardrooms and in your corporate rooms that we're not in right now, but you have those connections. And so I think having those conversations, questioning when things happen, that they're saying that you shouldn't invest in the long-term care trust, and instead you should go find some private plan, as if somehow there's something better out for you because you're a professional, that and that you shouldn't actually invest in a program that's going to actually benefit many of us and save us a lot of money on Medicaid and Medicare, so that we can then invest that back in smarter ways to help our community. So that's just something that came up yesterday in one of my conversations, but I feel like these are the connections when we're talking about healthcare equity, when we're talking about who gets to make decisions and justice, that these are all things that to me are connected. So I just wanted to add that piece.
Thank you so much, Senator. And, as Senator Saldaña mentioned, undocumented communities were excluded from much of the federal relief addressing the pandemic. And Washington created a aid fund to close those gaps. And we know some of the impacts from those funds, but what more could we do to support undocumented or more mixed status families?
Okay, I'll start this one, but so I think a couple of things. One is, that we have a couple of studies that are going on that were funded through our budget process. One is to look at unemployment insurance and who's not included, and how could we think about including folks that may not have federal status but are working here in Washington state, whether they're W-2s or I-9s. What we saw with the pandemic UI relief is that there's not just undocumented individuals. There's people that are gig workers. There are folks that work multiple jobs. There's a lot of parents and caregivers that end up not being able to access that employment insurance system, and yet they're doing valuable, many times what we deemed as essential work, and yet they don't have access to unemployment insurance. Another study and work group that's working is about workers' compensation. Again, undocumented individuals, day laborers, domestic workers, a lot of people that historically, were unpaid to do that work, were work that was done by Black slaves and by immigrant folks, were excluded from a lot of the workplace protections and the laws that we defend. So many folks that I care about, that are part of my family and my community, are excluded from those benefits. And so how do we update our labor laws to actually reflect that all work is dignified and all workers should have some basic fundamentals available to them and their families when they need it most? And so, so I think those are a couple things that to help us, because it's not easy, or else it would have already been done. There is some real legal issues that we need to address. There are issues around privacy and making sure that those that folks are actually getting the resource that earned the resource in the case of worker related benefits. And I think that, so I think those are things that we are wrestling with. We want engagement around that because I think we in Washington State are in a place where we can really lead the way on how we update our safety net to meet the needs of our economy and our workers today.
Great, thank you so much, Senator. Quick time check. I think we've got a few more minutes for questions. Number 6, the courts are dealing with huge backlogs, both civil and criminal, as a result of necessary adjustments to prevent the spread of COVID-19. What will the long-term impacts of this backlog be? And what do you think the legislature could do or should do to help reduce or eliminate the backlog? I'm looking at you, lawyers.
Well, I mean, I don't necessarily think we need to expand our court system as it is right now. I mean, there's so much injustice that's happening in our court system. I don't know if my judicial colleagues would agree with me on that, but what I would say is that we really need to find ways for folks to resolve their challenges outside the court system. I think we need to address prosecutorial discretion on the things that they're charging, because it doesn't make our communities safer. I'll just say I have a viewpoint. This is why I didn't want to be a judge. I wanted to be able to have a viewpoint and advocate for that viewpoint. Rep. Simmons probably could relate to that. The backlog was there before pandemic, and we have inched to a crawl, and we're about to have another tsunami of challenges when we get to implementation around the folks who are trying to mitigate or prevent evictions with the Senate Bill 5160 and all the attorneys. Like, there was so much fight against having attorneys helping indigent individuals preserve their housing, and they wanted us all to just go into the court system, and it didn't make any sense to me. The court system can't address it, and it doesn't help the families, and it doesn't help the landlords who are in a situation where they can't address their needs either. So we really need to prevent evictions from that particular perspective. But in the criminal court system, I think we just really need to overhaul what is a crime. What is community safety? Who is really being policed here, and what's the disproportionality that's happening that really affects Black and Brown folks in ways that it doesn't affect other parts of our community, or poverty. Simply being poor. I mean, there are so many folks who are in their attempt to address the housing shortage, or the response to Blake, or the response to the House Bill 1310 with use of force, is just arrest people. I'm like, we have local budgets that are spending more than 50% of their local dollars on criminal justice and law enforcement, and it's not making communities any safer. And what we've seen with the pandemic is that people having a lack of access to resources that support community is one of the challenges that's causing so much disruption in our community. So we need to get out in community, make sure that we have more support from mutual aid. We need to make sure that we are listening to community around what it needs to be healthy, thriving community members. And we can't, legislate and have everything litigated. Like, there's so many members of our community just stepping into the courthouse, regardless of whether it's for a small infraction like a ticket, or preventing housing. There's trauma associated with that building. And so we have to take that, in my opinion, we have to take that into account. And there are ways that we can reduce the backlog with that lens in mind. I'm not quite sure how we do it. And that's why we have to be in community. We have to listen to the legal aid community in particular, in ways that our representation has not been in the state legislature, because when folks are thinking about litigated cases, they're thinking about the multi-million-dollar cases. Come on, I'm thinking about the everyday case when the person is in dispute with their neighbor and they want to go home and be safe. I'm thinking about the person who may be contacted by police simply because they're holding a needle. So we have to really look at everything that's involved in our criminal justice system, and look at not only the criminal justice, but the civil justice that is so often injustice.
That is powerful. And it just reminds me of all the work that legal aid has done to overcome a lot of the, just the laws that are just rooted in racism, right? That sort of look at behavior and criminalize behavior, and, criminalize poverty, thinking about driving while license suspended. And obviously a number of you, were involved in that, and appreciate your efforts on that. And I believe there's more information on Washington Law Help around the Pierce v. DOL. NJP has put together a good amount of information out there. So we'll find the link and send that around. And speaking of just the criminal legal system and rulings, this February, the Washington State Supreme Court struck down the state's main drug possession crime in a case called State v. Blake. The ruling meant that there was no state law making simple possession of drugs a crime unless the legislature recriminalized it, which it has done via engrossed Senate Bill 5476. However, the criminal charges making possession crimes misdemeanors with mandatory diversion to services for at least the first two occasions are only in effect until July 1st, 2023. This means that the landscape for the issue is unsettled. And the question is, why do you think the legislature recriminalized drug possession, and what should be our permanent law here in Washington State, or our approach?
I'll go ahead and start with that. I'll just flag it was a really difficult time for me during the session because I do have a felony drug possession, and it still carry the trauma of being strip searched and jailed and arrested and incarcerated, and then not being allowed to go on school field trips with my kids or get jobs or even have to fight to become an attorney and so many other things and the collateral consequences. And I'm really, really proud of our Supreme Court for that decision. And it was really hard. I think the legislature was in a really hard place. It happened, it came down after policy cutoff around February 25th. And so we were scrambling. And before session, though, I was working with Representative Kirsten Harris-Talley and Representative Davis, and we were already on the path towards trying to model what Oregon had done and decriminalize a small amount of possession and actually give people treatment services instead. And so we were doing some of this work ahead of time, but the decision came down and not everybody was aligned. Not everybody, there's 147 members in the legislature, including the Senate and the House, and not everybody has had exposure to the same education around drug policy and the impacts. And it was very difficult to even get where we did at that particular moment. However, the legislature did pass something because it in my view, it was a harm reduction from the folks on this panel, a harm reduction move. And because local jurisdictions were passing ordinances, making it a gross misdemeanor, and we had to intercede so we could build in that diversion and provide the resources for the alternative so we could start building the alternative. And that's why it has a 2-year sunset, is because I think there are a large majority of us that want to build the alternative and come back and affirmatively decriminalize drug possession and treat it for the public health issue it is. And so that is why we did what we did and where we're at.
Yeah, I would add that this was incredibly difficult for us. We were not in alignment in all. The ones on this panel were in alignment, let's just say. But getting it over the finish line and preventing a greater harm with local jurisdictions having all these different ordinances, and it was incredibly difficult. But if we think about Blake in a bigger picture, there were 3 parts to it. There's the addressing the past with the harm that was caused by us having an unconstitutional statute. So we had to make the folks who were convicted under that statute whole again. So these are folks who need LFOs returned. These are folks who need to have resentencings or released or charges dismissed. We have to address that, and we have to be proactive about that. And we already know that counties and local jurisdictions are fighting us tooth and nail as we speak on the process. We don't have enough money to address that, and the legislature has already made another down payment of about $88 million towards that process, plus the actual resources such as the one that Rep. Simmons was talking about earlier today, with reentry services being funneled through the Department of Commerce, and then the innovation that she had with making sure that counties, or only the counties that had applied for funds with the cases, rather than just doing an allotment. Because what happens is, if you do an allotment, you have more prosecutors who will finish their body of work and then prosecute more crimes. That's not the intent. So Rep. Simmons was very proactive and progressive around getting the application of grant making process so that we would have the right people at the right time. And we've seen some counties really take active steps to address this challenge. And then, of course, part of that $88 million is also going to be resources to help with communities to develop what they need specifically. So what Spokane County may need in terms of reentry services, treatment services, recovery services. I mean, if you think about treatment as something that's paid by Medicaid, there are other services that surround folks that are not covered by other systems. And so the Blake decision really addresses not only the past, the current challenges of what we have with the gap of the recriminalization, but also really moving us towards the solutions that are community driven so that we don't have anyone ever having to be charged with possession. And then, of course, we know that there are a number of parallel statutes that may fall under the same unconstitutional scheme. So there's going to be more work to be done, and the sunset keeps us at the table and remaking the table.
And I want to be clear that the progressive end, respectfully, of both caucuses in the Senate and House really held the line on the sunset. As folks know, sunsets are not easy to get into policy in Washington State. They're rarely used. And it's a quick turnaround, 2 years. So we were really putting our feet on the accelerator saying, if we are going to recriminalize something that right now is in this decriminalized gray area, and I say gray area because there was a lot of systems pieces that were going to have to be worked out from that decision. I know for me, I'm personally an abolitionist. I want to see an end to slavery, which I need to see an end to our incarceration system because it's a legacy to slavery. For me, the only option at the end of those 2 years is to be fully decriminalized. And that means we have to invest and build the alternatives to incarceration in this state. Truly what abolition is about is building those alternatives. It was a hard vote. Rep. Simmons and I had many teary phone calls. I know it was hard for every person on this call. We worked with community to find a path, and it is truly one of those moments where you see legislative policy compromise. And I know the terrain built by people marching in the streets on 2020 set the tone for Blake and many of the policing justice, police accountability. And now there's going to be a whole set of incarceration systems bills and policy you're going to see as well. We're going to change what really in Washington State has been a heavily criminalized dynamic in Washington State. We have a very large, deep, and somewhat insidious incarceration system in our state. And I'm really proud that we're finally going to be building the alternatives to that.
Thank you so much. The next question touches a bit on the protests and the issues that were passed the last legislative session. So hopefully we can expand on it. After Derek Chauvin was convicted of the murder of George Floyd, the Black Members Caucus of the Washington State Legislature released a statement acknowledging the progress made to address police violence in Washington, but noting that the work to bring restorative justice in our communities has just begun in Washington State. Could you speak to your vision for restorative justice in our communities?
I mean, I'll start, and I will also kick it off to Rep. Harris-Talley, who's the vice chair of the BMC. One of the things that I found very interesting about being in the legislature this year is that while we passed many progressive legislation that had a racial equity lens, folks were so excited to pat themselves on the back. And we have more than 400 years of racial disparities, flat out anti-Black laws that are out there that we can't just, overturn in one legislative session. And then we also know once we do, these policies, we see how they get undermined in implementation and undermined with local jurisdictions who do the exact opposite. And so the Black Members Caucus is convening this summer to continue the conversations on how we will take the next strategy. And it is something that will be done in concert with community. So for me to say right now, all of the specifics around how we will address it, I think it's an ever evolving process that takes into account so many different perspectives, because we're like Rep. Harris-Talley said earlier, is that we're not a monolith. We have different perspectives within the Black Members Caucus, from lawyers to abolitionists, and sometimes they're one and the same, okay, to law enforcement, small business owners, and their individual expertise is broad, and we have very, very interesting conversations that help us advance those goals. And working with the civil legal aid community in particular will be one that is going to be a priority to ensure that voices of marginalized communities, that we're not just solving for one challenge that then creates a challenge in another community, that we're looking at this as a holistic thing, but with the lens of removing the anti-Black barriers that always exist, and it's not to create barriers for other communities. If that's articulatable for me, I really want to make sure that we are not left holding the bag, and that a lot of times our advocacy brings new conversations and new action to the table, but then we're the last ones to benefit from that advocacy.
And I just close by saying, I love what Rep. Taylor, Senator Saldaña, Rep. Simmons said. All of us talked right about the down payments that were made this year. Really getting to restoring people, though, means deep investment, quite frankly, with what Rep. Taylor just outlined, for generations. And that means economic equity and revenue and investment upstream. I'm sick of talking about safety and only talking about police, and not talking about housing, and not talking about education, and not talking about mental health services and healthcare and all that. Moving those dollars upstream to those things will start to restore, will give folks the room they need and the resources they need to be healed. And that's really what restorative justice is at the end of the day. It's healing the traumas from our past to bloom the integrity and promise of our future. And so Washington State we have the scale and vision to do it. We need to do it faster, bigger, and bolder together.
Thank you so much. I think we've got 2 minutes left. Anybody want to provide closing remarks?
What I would say, I mean, I feel like I'm home here today with the legal aid community and the powerful work that you do every single day. The justice that you bring to folks who often are frustrated with us. We know that there's not enough of us out there doing this work. And knowing that your legislature is really looking to partner with this community to truly ensure that we are implementing policies that don't just create another layer of disparities for communities, that we actually have anti-poverty legislation, that we have racial justice legislation, and that we are working towards a better community together from folks who are as invested in this work as we are.
Yeah, I'll say my closing remark, because there's a question about when do we have critical mass or when we have representation. I mean, I think we need a lot more representative sens in our legislature, in our city councils, at our county commission levels. We need to make sure that our elected bodies look more like our kindergarten rooms and look more like the future, because we need people invested in the future to be helping shape how we make decisions today. And I think the last thing I'll say is, because I know it's easy to other, whether it's a police officer, whether it's someone in Eastern Washington, whether it's the person, down the street from you. And I think that's a challenge, is that we have got to create an inclusive restorative justice. It means inclusivity. And people often, when they say things, when they act out in a certain way, it's out of a fear and out of ignorance. And out of, and so I think that wherever we can, it's not everyone's work, but I do think some of y'all, can take on this work, is how are you helping bring people along? How are you making sure that they cannot other you, so that they stay in conversation and eventually make those kinds of changes? Because we have, as Rep. Simmons said, we have 144 legislators, and many of them are hearing from certain people that are informing them to make decisions. And Voting Rights Act is another bill that I'm very proud that we got passed over the last few years. It needs to continue to be improved upon and implemented. And because when you go across the mountains, there's a lot of BIPOC folks that are not being represented. And until that representation changes, it does limit the kinds of progressive change and how quickly we can make that change happen. So please engage. If you have someone in your community, if you are a client, as someone you're mentoring, have you asked them to run for office? It's not just the attorneys, it's the people, and of course Rep. Simmons both, but you don't have to be an attorney to run. It's nice to have some good attorneys that we can count on to help inform our decisions. So thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been a great panel, and we look forward to continuing this conversation down in Olympia and in community. So thank you so much.